I'm hoping that most of you are generally familiar with the Hearth Act. I think everyone's heard about it for many years now, and now it's happening. So some of this is probably going to be a review for some of you, some of it new, hopefully, for some of you, and this will just get us going, and we can, start a conversation about this. So I'm just going to quickly go through some of the big changes and what's happened so far and what's going to be happening in the next little while. So I think many of you are familiar with the changes to the ESG program. So ESG is a formula program that goes to city, county, and state governments. Traditionally has funded shelter and outreach services and is now funding shelter and outreach services, and also what had previously been funded under HPRP, so rapid rehousing and homelessness prevention. I think these are pretty familiar for most of you. I think the news that we've been hearing is that there's just going to be less ESG funding this year than there was last year, and that's something that many of you are probably already feeling, but if you're a provider, then maybe it hasn't gotten to you yet, but unfortunately there's just less money coming from the federal government. And it's actually a pretty significant decrease, unfortunately. So whereas nationally last year there was $286 million allocated to the ESG program, this year there will be $225 million. So it's quite a bit less. 215 million. So it's actually even worse than I just said. So, but those otherwise not many changes to the ESG programs. I think HUD is continually clarifying sort of little rules. Like, for example, people have had the question frequently about whether people who are being served by rapid rehousing programs continue to be eligible for permanent supportive housing, and has sort of put out some guidance that yes, people continue to be eligible for permanent supportive housing even if they are currently being served and are housed in a rapid rehousing program. So they continue to be eligible for permanent supportive housing and continue to be eligible for permanent supportive housing dedicated to people experiencing chronic homelessness as well. Although they're not considered homeless while they're in those units and wouldn't be counted on point-in-time counts in those units. So ESG, I think people are pretty familiar with. Some of the bigger changes that are coming in the next little while, next several months, there's governance. There are governance requirements in the Hearth Act, and that HUD is sort of passing down to people. So whereas before governance of COCs was a very loose concept, it's going to be a more stringent concept, although not a stringent concept going forward. People are going to be required to have boards that make decisions. The boards are going to have to be representative of the homeless populations generally. People will have to have conflict of interest rules, and this is actually kind of a big issue for people. If your COC decision making is done by mostly providers, the conflict of interest stuff gets very sticky, and there are going to have to be rules for that going forward, so that people who have an interest aren't voting on things that directly affect them. So governance is going to be an issue. There's a sort of a deadline of August of 2014 for having a governance process in place. So that's one of the big issues. Another big issue is centralized or coordinated intake. Every community will be required to have a centralized or coordinated intake process, and every funded provider will be required to participate in a coordinated or centralized intake process. So let me ask real quick, how many of people in the room are providers of any sort, homeless assistance providers? Raise your hand. Okay, almost everyone in the room. How many of you are HUD funded, either through the COC or through the ESG program? So almost everyone. So that's why you're here, right? Because this is your funding source we're talking about. So you're all going to have to participate in a centralized or coordinated assessment process. I want to stress a couple things. This coordinated assessment often gets sort of associated with centralized intake. Centralized intake is a form of coordinated assessment, but there are many other forms of coordinated assessment. And I will say most communities around the country are not using a centralized intake model. Many are using sort of a tiered model that starts with 211 and then involves visiting a service provider. But the keys to centralized or coordinated intake are you have a universal process for how people get into either shelter or other interventions in your continuum of care. And it doesn't really matter where they start, but they have an equal likelihood of getting to any other place in the system. So that's the main one. And then you have the decisions are made based on some set of criteria that you've spelled out. So often, whether a person gets into a program can be a subjective process. I'm sure that's not the case in New York State, but in other parts of the country, it's the case. And HUD is going to be requiring that people spell out what's the eligibility, for programs, and how do you prioritize? So if you have 100 people that are eligible for a program, but you have 10 spots available, how are you deciding who gets those 10 spots? And that's something that's going to have to be spelled out in writing. Another change that's made by the Hearth Act that I think hasn't really sort of sunk in entirely yet is that disability-related services can't be required in programs anymore. So I think there are a lot of programs, again, I'm sure this doesn't affect New York State, but everywhere else in the country, where people would have to participate in substance abuse treatment, for example, to be in the program, or have to participate in mental health services to be in the program. That's not going to be allowed anymore. Unless the program is specifically designed to be a disability program, for example, you are a substance abuse treatment program, then mandating participation in those services will not be allowed. You can sort of mandate some level of participation in case management, like a person can theoretically be required to meet with a case manager on a periodic basis, but sort of the level of requirement that people participate in services is not going to be allowed going forward. Now, I will say that the different field offices are applying this at different rates and at different speeds, so some funded grantees are getting some more time to comply. Some people are being pressed to do that quicker, but this is something we're going to face going forward. And then the last thing I want to talk about before we sort of open up and have a broader discussion is about the NOFA and outcome measures and the scoring criteria for the NOFA. How many of you, by the way, let me ask one more question, are involved in is either you're the lead agency for your COC or you're not including the people here at the table, but or you're deeply involved in the scoring and the putting together of the NOFA and all that stuff? Okay, so most of you aren't, but I think this is actually really helpful to know. The NOFA process changed a lot this year. So you guys probably have heard about Tier 1 and Tier 2. There was for most of the life of HUD Homeless Assistance funding, if you were a renewal program, your funding was pretty much guaranteed, unless you broke the law or you were out of compliance in some way. There was 1 year back in 2000 where there was a little shakiness, but for the most part, funding had been guaranteed. And that was, again, true this year, although there was a big scare, and it will not be true every year going forward. So HUD created this tiering process where you sort of created your higher priority renewals that were safe and that would essentially automatically get funded, but then you put some renewals at risk because there wasn't enough funding to keep all the renewals safe. And this is going to be the case probably for the next couple of years until we get out of this fiscal jam that we're in. It looks like this year is going to be worse than last year as far as that's concerned. So there's going to be less. Your Tier 1 is going to be smaller this year. There are going to be more projects put into Tier 2 in this year's NOFA, and I don't know about next year's. But a couple sort of points about that. I think there were a lot of different strategies that people used to tier their projects. A lot of COCs around the country use this process of shaving funding from every renewal to fit everything into Tier 1. And that turned out to be the worst possible strategy this year. Because if you instead used a strategy of we're going to just create these performance criteria and the best performers are going to go in Tier 1 and the worst performers are going to go in Tier 2, what would have happened this year is everything would have been funded fully. And the people who sort of shaved a little from everything to put everything in Tier 1, those projects all got funded at 95% or whatever factor you use to shave programs. So this year, at least, the shaving sort of strategy was not an optimal one, and it probably is going to be a risky one going forward for two reasons. One, HUD doesn't really want you to do that, and there are a lot of criteria in the NOFA that focus on outcomes and showing that you're trying to improve outcomes. And the idea that you're sort of taking a little from every project equally is not really sort of incentivizing outcomes in a way. And so I think the people who tried to show they were outcome focused by ranking projects by outcomes are going to score a little better in this NOFA and going forward.